Welcome back to Sustainable Views, the podcast looking at sustainability policy and regulation in depth. My name is Florence Jones, a journalist at Sustainable Views who covers UK climate and sustainability policy. And today I'm very excited to be speaking to Tim Lenton OBE. Professor Tim Lenton is a leading climate scientist. He is chairing climate change and earth system science and was the founding director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. And he's particularly renowned for his work identifying climate tipping points and chairs the Global Tipping Points Initiative of environmental researchers. Lovely to have you here, Tim.
Thanks, Lawrence.
So I'm speaking to our listeners from a now slightly cooler London as we head into the end of August. But as it has been all over the UK, summer has been incredibly hot. I suppose at one point we used to talk about climate change as being something far off into the future or something that affected other parts of the world. But now it's very much reflected in our everyday lives here in the UK. In the 2025 edition of the Global Tipping Point report, your group of researchers talk about this new reality that we have to grapple with as we approach rising global temperatures of 1.5 degrees. And I'm hoping that today you can help our listeners understand the role that tipping points play within that and what this kind of new reality means within the context of tipping points. So a good place to start, I think, is thinking about risk. This is something that we've seen in our reporting has become a growing theme across policy, business, finance, and also wider kind of climate conversations in society. And I was wondering if you could kick us off talking about what tipping points are and how they kind of impact our understanding of climate risk.
For sure. Yeah, when I've got a kind of any audience, really, I often introduce the idea of a tipping point by inviting people to lean back on their chair to that balance point where, a small nudge one way or the other could make a very big difference to your fate or state. You could either end up in one stable state, back upright, or flying over backwards into a very different, less favourable state of the system, you and the chair. And we all know that change, when it gets underway, is kind of self-propelling and quite hard to reverse. You can kind of wheel your arms around frantically, but you'll struggle to recover the situation. And that quality of self-propelling change that tends to be sort of abrupt or accelerating, at least initially, and is hard to reverse. Those are some key qualities of tipping points in general, including bad ones we could cross in the climate, where we're talking about committing change to some alternative state of bits of the climate system, like losing ice sheets or losing the Amazon rainforest or the coral reefs, or reorganizing the circulation of the Atlantic Ocean and fundamentally changing the state of the climate. And yeah, those particular qualities of tipping points are important when we think in terms of risk. Because if you have like reversible events, let's say you're not quite sure how bad climate change or some other change is going to be, but you think the change you're faced with is sort of reversible and you can adjust your strategy as you go along, then often, depending on your risk aversion, but it might lean you towards, we'll just wait and see how bad it's going to get. And then we might, if we decide things are getting worse quicker than we thought they were, just as we're seeing in the climate now, let's act harder later and redress the problem. Well, that doesn't work if you heading towards or cross the tipping point, because then you can't get out. And in that sense of risk, we should be approaching them very differently. And the natural response would be precautionary. If you thought the consequences of an irreversible tipping point were pretty bad, and we'll talk about that, then we all, by common sense, would be acting sooner to minimize the likelihood or the risk of getting into that eventuality. We could debate whether we're really doing that. I think most listeners will probably think, no, we're not at the moment. And in fact, we said in our report, we crossed a kind of tipping point in the biosphere because we've seen a decimation of tropical coral reefs in the last couple of years as the global temperature went temporarily above 1.5 degrees centigrade. Decimation, I mean 84% of reefs suffering extreme bleaching and dieback. Some may recover, but what that matters, at least it matters for the estimated 500 million people whose livelihoods depend on the reefs because they fish the fisheries that are supported by the reefs, or because they live on the coast that's protected from storm surges by the reefs. So it might seem distant from UK shores, that example, but in a global context, already significant.
Mm. And what do the existence of tipping points mean for climate planning? Like, this has obviously become a very common practice in whether it's in companies or in policy making, this idea of having a climate scenario and then building a plan off the back of it. Do tipping points kind of disrupt this idea of climate planning? Do you think we need to be doing something different?
Well, we should certainly continue to be planning and doing a mixture of things, trying to mitigate, to reduce the risk, but accept that we might have to do some adaptation to be prepared for what we can't avoid. But the differences that can come, well, there's a few. Perhaps the most fundamental one is some tipping points change even the direction of climate change or the direction of what you're expecting in terms of the impacts. So maybe we'll come and talk a bit more about what happens if there's a collapse in the Atlantic Ocean's great overturning circulation. But for the UK and Northwest Europe, that could actually, if it happens at the low levels of global warming, could plunge us into much colder winters whilst not really affecting the summers, greatly increasing seasonality. But at the same time, it can, like other tipping points, amplify changes we were expecting. So in that case, sea level height adjusts simply because you change the way in which water is getting moved around in the ocean. And unfortunately, it adjusts upwards by eventually half a metre or possibly more around the North Sea and northeast seaboard of the US, on top of what we're expecting from melting ice sheets and the ocean expanding as it gets warmer. So in that case, it's not a change in the direction of the impact, it's just making it bigger sooner, probably. And then you've got that irreversibility quality, although one should note that it's quite hard to reverse climate change full stop. So even if changes are reversible in principle, a lot of climate change you have to think of as hard to reverse in practice. But with tipping points, we're talking like really hard to reverse in the sense we get committed into a different climate that could be with us for centuries or longer, or millennia in the case of losing ice sheets and things like this. So how do those things affect scenarios? Well, we really have to be acute. We have to think at the practical end about whoever we are with the scenario, whether it's a company or whatever. What's our risk exposure, if that's what we're trying to work out? How's that altered by the tipping points? And because the examples I've given probably indicate, because the tipping points can alter that risk exposure quite markedly, we ought to be thinking about them in the scenarios. Where that gets difficult is, well, what's the probability of the tipping point and how does it change with warming? We know something about that. As a rule, tipping points get more likely as we warm the world up, but there's inevitably quite a lot of uncertainty around how close we are to the tipping points. We can talk about whether we can nail that down, but it's like, you might say it's like a sort of wild card, or having to consider different versions of the future and you're not sure which one you're going to end up in, but you know if the warming is higher, let's say in a scenario sense, you might be more likely to end up in the tipped future. And then is your strategy, if you have one, because you bother to do the scenarios, is it robust to this different version of the future? And it can be. There can be lots of no regrets options that work either way. I was talking about us getting plunged in Northwest Europe into a colder winter as well.
Mm-hmm.
You'd want to have a better insulated building stock than we do now, and you'd want it to be. You want some air source heat pumps that can cool you in the summers that are still super hot and keep you warmer in the winters with much less energy input. And your wind, and if you want to double down on offshore wind, which I hope we continue to do, that's going to work fine past the tipping point, because I'm afraid the winter storms and the winter storm track is stronger in this tipping scenario. So even though tragically in this future world we're going to have sea ice extending back down over the North Sea eventually, I think the wind turbines will still be doing fine.
That's one way of putting it, yeah. And in terms of the relationship then between tipping points and you talked about warming makes these tipping points more likely to be breached. Of course, we've had a lot of discussion in the UK recently about 1.5 as a target and whether now that we're looking at overshoot, should 1.5 be abandoned, should be moving to something else? What is the relationship between tipping points and 1.5? How important is it that 1.5 is kept?
It's vital to keep 1.5, even though we're going to transgress it, because we should think of it as somewhere we want to get back to or below to control these risks. And really, it's the simple message is we want to minimize both the amount we go over the 1.5 degrees C in temperature terms and the duration, the amount of time we spend going over it, because that's like the area under a curve to us nerds. The bigger the area under that curve of exceedance, the risk scales perhaps non-linearly actually with that. It's hard to say because of all the uncertainties, but if you take our current best estimates, we'd actually see that there was quite a potential clustering of tipping point risk in which it goes up in the critical 1.5 to 2 degrees C range. New systems become more perhaps prone to tipping, whilst others it becomes more likely, and quite a lot of the probability loading is in that range, and it obviously carries on getting worse above that. But that's sort of a reason why fighting for every 0.1 of a degree C or every year we could avoid is still a very worthy cause from the information we have, whilst perhaps being pragmatic and saying, we can't completely rule out some of these tipping points now, and maybe we crossed the coral reef one, and maybe that has got an impact on what I'm concerned about. And in that case, we have to think, okay, what's the adaptation strategy? Because there's still something we can do to reduce the exposure to the impacts of vulnerability to that exposure usually.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you find it worrying when we're I know there's been some high level policy conversations about, 1.5 is just a number, it's just kind of an arbitrary target. Would you dispute that?
Yes, at some level. I mean, of course, you could have picked. It's hard. This is a tricky one because, of course, every level of warming has different kind of level of risk associated with it, and it's not as if we were wholly safe below 1.5. We can't rule out that we might have committed to loss of big ice sheets already, but what we do know is the warmer you get and the more you go over the tipping point for an ice sheet, the faster it'll melt. So it still matters. But yeah, it's not like you might make the case, okay, it's not like at 1.5 you suddenly fundamentally change the Earth system. That's not true. There's risks before and there's risks after, but there's a sense in which the risks are really starting to kick up around that level, and that's somewhat, you could say, somewhat confirmed by what's happened to the coral reefs, and arguably, if we step aside from tipping points, I think everybody is realizing that the impacts associated with a given level of warming are starting to escalate much steeper with warming than either we thought they were going to or that we'd been experiencing so far. So it's not you got to think about it in those terms, but it helps to focus the policy mind as well as all of our minds to have some kind of canonical, I think, ballpark figure in mind. And really it emerged from a recognition that from the small island states in particular, that 2 degrees centigrade of global warming could be an existential risk for them. But from our tipping points perspective, wow, there's a world of difference between 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, just as there's there's another world of difference to 2.5 or 3. So in those crude kind of terms, it's useful.
Yeah. And where do you kind of see those consequences emerging? You mentioned that we're already kind of seeing some of that. Is there particular parts of the economy where you're expecting to see those kind of tipping point consequences, or is it more to do with kind of, the hot weather that I referenced at the top of the episode we've been seeing?
It's both, definitely. So what we think of as the short-term extreme events, the changes in the distribution of those, like the heat extremes. I mean, I found it, and I continue to find it difficult to work or physiologically uncomfortable in the heat wave. So I know what my science colleagues also tell me, that labour productivity is definitely declining in this new climate reality. But we may moan in the UK, but we're not at the sharpest end of this. So even when we're talking short-term extremes, some of my other work highlights the risks that of particularly in the tropics, where you have escalating millions of numbers of people exposed to unprecedented heat extremes, and even worse, combined heat and humidity extremes that can be life-threatening. So that's where my thoughts go on that front straight away. But yeah, for the tipping points, we're starting to stray into that territory, it would appear, with the coral reefs. Again, maybe the people primarily impacted are in the tropics, but we are increasing the risk of some shifts in the climate that would hit us here in the mid-latitudes. And of course, we should know that the Arctic and the poles are already showing accelerated impacts and change. So it's all in there in the mix, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And I think we liked to tell ourselves, especially if the audience is listening from the UK, that we got it lucky, which to a degree we have. We have a fairly maritime climate that's buffering some of the worst end of things, but we might have all just had a wake-up call that we're not that well buffered as the fires continue to blaze in South Wales as I chat to you. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's a lot of very heavy things there. I know you also sometimes describe yourself as being a cautious optimist because of your work around positive tipping points. Could you kind of introduce us to those and maybe a little bit about how we can contribute to them as individuals, or whether companies can, or policymakers?
Absolutely. So I kind of introduced at the start, tipping points, it's about where change becomes self-propelling within a system. And in this case, what I'm talking about, positive tipping points, I'm talking about actually proven instances, as well as a bunch of opportunities, shall we say, for change in the direction I'm firm that we want, which is towards zero emissions, can itself become self-propelling. And part of the message is also we've got more agency than we think we do to be part of those self-propelling changes. And what am I talking about here? I could be talking about things like the fact that there's an exponential uptake now, arguably self-propelling, of solar panels around the world, solar power. There's also a spreading positive tipping point for the uptake of electric vehicles for personal mobility. That doesn't have to mean cars. It can mean like electric rickshaws or electric bikes or electric motorbikes in sub-Saharan Africa or whatever. And what's going on there? What are the amplifiers within these sort of, we call them social and technological systems? Well, they're fairly familiar. The more we make something, so the more people adopt, say, the electric vehicle, the better it's going to get. So that's sort of learning by doing, particularly the battery. That's the core difference in the electric vehicle. But the cheaper it's going to get as well. That's economies of scale in simple language. And also, the more accessible it may get, and other qualities, so affordability, attractiveness, accessibility, all increase with adoption. And that's a self-amplifying situation. Each one of us who adopts kind of makes the thing that little bit better and more attractive for the next person to adopt. And that's why you can get to a tipping point where these new technologies can start to take off and push out the incumbent technologies. And I'm sure we're seeing that actually with renewable solar and, in the right context, wind power worldwide, because they're the cheapest form of electricity everywhere now, basically. But I'd also make the case it's happening for electrifying personal mobility, whatever the naysayers want to say about it. And we can talk about that. It doesn't happen. The tipping point will start in some places and then spread across markets. And even those who resist it, unfortunately, eventually, they're called the laggards, but they change eventually. So yeah, there's other elements to this, right? It's not just, renewable electricity tipping point is a big deal, especially if we can get anywhere near towards eventually 100% renewable electricity, because a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions just come from power generation. And then personal mobility, just on the roads, let's say, along with trucks, it's about 13-14% of greenhouse gas emissions. So electrifying all of that's a big deal. Obviously, there are some other sectors, heating our homes and buildings and cooling them. When we talked about that, heat pumps, they also show some learning curves. There's a bit less, which is the term I'm using for this ability for the price to come down and the quality to go up with adoption. Although that's a bit maybe less well evidenced at the moment and a bit more heterogeneous. But yeah, many of the sectors and the activities, the great majority of greenhouse gas emissions, you could say, they're in sectors and activities where there is credible reason to think you could have positive tipping. And obviously policies can bring those tipping points forwards. And we've been studying that in some depth. And essentially, you want policies that support the new, not penalise the old. It's more important to catalyse and invest in the new. That starts with R&D investment, which often comes initially from public money. But when the clean technology gets near to competitiveness, then it's really great if you have governments that are willing to say to the market quite clearly, we're going to phase out the fossil fuel technology here and phase in the clean technology. So that's things like bans on petrol and diesel car sales in our market from 2030 or 2035, and similar story for electric trucks, gas boilers, and so on. Now, obviously, everyone wants to be concerned about issues of equity and justice in this transition as well, so we can talk about that. But fundamentally, switching to a kind of clean electricity-powered future, electrifying as much as we can, that's a great. That has massive justice benefits as well as climate benefits. Ultimately, after all, we're talking about having the cheapest source of kind of power and electricity ever with renewables. And so that means we're already seeing electricity getting to the 600 odd million people in sub-Saharan Africa who've never had it before, because suddenly getting pay-as-you-go tariff for a solar panel with a little battery, some LED lights and a fan is accessible. It's affordable now in a way it would never have been. So that's hugely exciting. I feel all of that is super positive, and we could seize that opportunity. And I call myself, I'd probably say, a conditional optimist, because tipping points work conditional on a fraction of other people joining in. And the great thing about tipping points is you don't typically need the majority. That's the whole point. You don't need half or the majority to adopt to reach a tipping point where the adoption becomes self-propelling. Some people will say it's like canonical number of 20%, but it really varies in the context. But that's part of the secret.
Yeah, I mean, that's uplifting to hear. And a lot of what we kind of cover at Sustainable Views, we think a lot about influence, especially like corporate influence, be that negative around lobbying or potentially positive. When we're talking about this kind of getting enough people to then launch the tipping point, is there kind of a conversation to be had around influence and scale? If kind of large actors take on these things, does that help accelerate a tipping point?
It absolutely can, and in some cases has. So when we look at things like buyers' alliances, they're quite important in the space. We've seen a coalition of companies that make a lot of use of shipping containers to get their goods around the world come together to push for green ammonia powering of shipping, which is a tipping point that's further away. So it needs this kind of extra push to get it towards cost competitiveness. And we've seen that the Singapore port, for example, and Rotterdam, I think, kind of coming on board with that. So buyers' alliances, also for net zero steel and some other cases, are valuable. Obviously, companies, depending on their size, may also be, in some cases, procuring enough of their own electric vehicles for that to be a measurable adoption, just in the way that the public sector can choose to adopt them, and that can bring things forward. So yeah, and lobbying can cut both ways for sure. We think of the negative lobbying of the incumbents wanting to maintain the status quo, but we can also look at other situations where, in markets like Norway, where they've tipped to electric vehicles, you get you get new automotive associations or collectives sort of lobbying to maintain the support and the push for the transition. Just as in the UK, you could say a positive lobby built up around the growth of offshore wind power and helping, should we say, reinforce the government's confidence that it should keep pushing on that. Just as there's another kind of feedback loop between policymakers and the general public, who in that case initially were like a bit magnanimous, I think, but then started to see, oh, wow, this is kind of good. We've got this new export industry where British companies have worked out the best way to install offshore wind, and they're exporting that to the rest of the world. Even though it's Danish companies that are making the turbines, we're still doing okay out of this. And a positive narrative built up, possibly because we were so NIMBYist about onshore wind as well. But then everybody was just not that bothered, frankly, about, or not apparently comfortable with the sight of, the sea of turbines in the distance. And just, positive feedback loop gets going with the media helping in that instance, positive stories. Of course, I am deeply frustrated to see some quarters of society and the media trying to fight back and be anti-net zero. It seems to me utter craziness and kind of despicable. So they're obviously their own kind of lobby, but one should not be surprised by that, just as one should not be surprised to look across the pond and see what's going on, because whenever the incumbents feel that their position of power, relative power and privilege is under threat, they're going to fight to retain it. That's common sense. We just have to remember that the majority, and all the surveys back this up, are strongly supportive of a stronger policy in accelerating the transition to net zero.
Yeah, well, hopefully that acts as a nice kind of empowering message to our listeners. I certainly need it at the moment. Some of the stories we've had this summer have been frustrating, so I do appreciate that on a personal level too. That brings us to the close of the episode. Thank you so much for being here, Tim, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. Should you wish to follow this podcast or any of our other articles, head to sustainableviews.com.